says that don't pursue your own interests, and then at the next thing he says, speak of it as a delight. We kind of feel like those are contradictory statements, like if I'm going to have fun, I have to pursue my own interests. It's an interesting difference. So there's a way to enjoy the Lord on the Sabbath and not pursue your own interests, but still be restful and enjoy it. And I think that's a trick that we all have to really work through. How do we make this an awesome, enjoyable day that everyone looks forward to, but without making it, a movie marathon every week, So that's a trick. What else do you guys see here? We have to realize, you guys, we have kind of a religious bent. A lot of people sort of, Martin Luther talked about that, and one of the reasons why a lot of people are afraid to do this is because they think they're going to start condemning themselves or other people as soon as they start a practice like this. And that's why I love that passage, that verse, because it's so clear. No one has to do this. You should never, specifically it says, never judge anyone for how they choose or not choose to keep a particular day. That's not the point of this. Because Christ has come, the gospel means we're already holy. We're already perfect. So the Sabbath cannot perfect us anymore. And because of that, you can't rest in that practice as a way of pleasing God. You're already pleasing God because you're in Christ. And to have any practice in your rhythm that causes you to feel like it's making you a better person than somebody else is really to deny the gospel. And so how do you practice the Sabbath in a way that doesn't cause you to judge people? I have a friend who was talking about some people that they knew that really judged them for keeping the Sabbath, like told them, you shouldn't do that, that's sort of Old Testament stuff, and really was condemning. And then a few months later, they decided to keep the Sabbath, but they did it on a different day. Then they turned around and condemned him again and said, you're doing it on the wrong day. God's not pleased with you. It's like, that's really discouraging. These conversations need to be, we're in Christ. The gospel has made us holy. How does this benefit your family? That's when it becomes a really important question. And so a lot of these practices from the Old Testament, you really have to, and this puts a lot of impetus on the mother and father to really talk through. Anybody who's the head of a household, or running a household, how do we do this? And what's life-giving for our family, given that Christ has come and we're living on this side of the cross? What else do you guys see here?
I feel like one interesting thing is that there's the idea of work being finished or completed. It's not simply a pause. There's actually a cycle that happens, and you should feel when you get to that day like you've completed something, as opposed to just, I'm going to push off everything to the back burner for a few hours until I get too stressed out. And so that in both of those passages you see that. Also with giving you a 2-day supply on the previous day, so it's like you have to prepare and complete everything before you do this.
Yeah, so in a lot of our Sabbath meals, I'll say this to the kids, I'll say there's two kinds of rest. One kind of rest is when you're so exhausted because you're doing something that you need to take a break. It's not done yet, but you're like, I can't go on one more minute. And you're like, oh, I got to rest. That's one kind of rest. There's a totally different kind of rest, which is, I'm done. I've completed it. And now I rest because there's nothing else to do. The Sabbath needs to feel like the second kind of rest, particularly because of the gospel. We have the ability to rest like no one else. We can sit there and say, it's done. When Jesus said, it is finished, that should make our Sabbaths so fulfilling because it's completed. There's nothing more we need to do. We can't make ourselves any more holy. And so it really creates a real type of rest. And I think that the church is supposed to be really recognized by that kind of feeling. Like, wow, look at those people. They're so free. They feel like they're not striving. You know, that kind of freedom and release gives birth to a certain kind of life, a certain kind of family, a certain kind of community that the other kind of rest of, oh yeah, we're just depressed all the time and frustrated and pushing forward and never feel like anything's done. That's not the kind of rest we're talking about in the Sabbath. So I think that's really important. That's the way that God rested. That's the way we're supposed to rest. What else do you guys see here? It could be in any of these passages.
I think I just see how outraged the Jews at the time would have been with Jesus comparing the line, anybody who desecrates it must be put to death, versus don't let anybody condemn you for not celebrating it.
Yeah, you can see how hard this collision was. To say Jesus is Lord means that I'm going to trust Jesus with the fact that I'm not going to get condemned to die if I follow his example. And his example, I think sometimes it's confused. His example really wasn't an example of breaking the Sabbath. His goal was to intentionally break man-made rules about the Sabbath. He loved doing that because they were inventing rules left and right to try to make the Sabbath more than it was. And so Jesus was like, part of his nature in trying to make a point about who he was to go ahead and break man-made rules, and the one that he enjoyed breaking the most was the Sabbath rules that were man-made. So yeah, I mean that's why when you see a religious spirit begin to come up against somebody's practice or not practice, it's really so against the nature and the example of Jesus. And the other thing you said, the fact that they were to be put to death if they broke the Sabbath, that's a pretty harsh rule. And so, like to this day, if you ask a rabbi, of all of the holidays in the Torah, Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, that's super, super high holy day, or Sukkot, or Shavuot, or any of these holidays, which holiday is the most important? Which one should we keep with the most regularity or the most intensity? And they'll tell you the Sabbath. That's the most important holiday, because the way that they determined that is the penalty was the greatest. The penalty for other ones was like be cut off. This one was death, and so they're like, this is it. This is a very important day. So Jesus playing with that holiday, that part of the calendar, even though it happens every week, we might think, because it happens every week, it's not as important, or it's not as big of a deal. That also is something that I think as families we can really think through. Like, just because it's a 7-day rhythm, is it less significant? And this is, of course, our choice again, but it's interesting the way God designed the calendar than annual rhythms. Sometimes we're really passionate about annual holidays and really lax about weekly rhythms. And whereas if you look at the way the Torah was designed, weekly rhythms were given an even more level of intensity. We're going to have a whole training on rhythms in the Torah, but I always thought that was interesting how that penalty was so high. Anything else stand out to you guys in this? Any of these passages? Yeah, Michael?
When it says, remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with a strong hand and powerful arm. That is why the Lord your God is commanding you to rest. Yeah. The idea of like remembering your identity and rest. So then I'll be like spiraling out. It'll be like spiral back in and run.
Yeah, imagine an entire day to remember who you are in light of the gospel. That's really what he's saying. And the whole reason, and we learn from the New Testament, the whole reason they were slaves in Egypt was as a illustration of the gospel. It was telling that, it was a pre-telling of that story. So a lot of times people realize that in their own life, they really struggle with, anger, or they struggle with loving others, or they struggle with, all these myriad of sins or all these myriad of virtues that we're supposed to develop. And the reason we struggle with those things is always an identity issue. We don't actually believe the gospel. And so to have one day a week to remember who you are, and he says it also in another way, it's the Lord who makes you holy, which is another crazy statement about that. He's saying that the Lord makes you holy means that the way you get holy is to rest. Isn't that crazy? And to remember. So if you talk to a typical Christian and they're like, I'm really struggling with these sins, and I don't feel like I'm really doing these things right. How often do we say, oh, you're not resting and remembering enough? We almost always say, do this, right? But to have one whole day that we focus on who we are, on being and not doing, and that doing is actually very distracting in the process of building an identity. It can be. So to rest on the Sabbath day is to remember that you're not going to make yourself holy. It's through rest and through remembering that you become more holy. So that's just another example of why doing something like this can be really useful. Anything else stand out to you guys? Okay, so these can pop up later but I just think it's really important to have a biblical foundation for what we're about to go into when we talk about the practice itself. So I want to talk just real quick about why I and our family Sabbaths and practices Shabbat, and then I'd like other families to talk about that too. But Lucas.
Real quick.
Yeah.
I hear Shabbat and Sabbath.
Yes.
Sabbath.
Yes.
Is there any distinction between those?
Yeah, I was going to explain that. Yeah, so Shabbat is the Hebrew word. Sabbath is the anglicized version of that word. The word Shabbat comes from Shavat, which means to cease. And so in New York, if you talk to a Jew in New York, they'll call it Shabbos, because most of them linguistically have been influenced by Yiddish. In Israel, they've gotten rid of all TH sounds. There's no TH sound in modern Hebrew. So even Sabbath would become Sabbat, but they call it Shabbat because it comes from Shavat. So just like every language, there's kind of like a linguistic devolution that happens, especially when you're trying to continuously transliterate a word from one language to another. And so Sabbath is just our way of saying Shabbat. But because of Israel and because there's so many more people now that are saying Shabbat, we're going to, I think, encounter a linguistic shift where the word is probably going to start to be pronounced more and more Shabbat. Although in our country, it's going to be a long time before that happens. But they're the same word. The other thing I like about the word Shabbat is that it literally means Saturday in Hebrew as well. So it's kind of it also refers to the day that it is. It is Shabbat. Saturday is that day.